Iran is struggling, but if you give them cash, if you give them incentives, if you remove the economic sanctions too quickly, if you open bank accounts for Iran too quickly without getting real substantive concessions, what's going to happen? That money is going to flow to Iran, and then it's going to be funneled from Iran to Hezbollah and other terror organizations, and you could have a worse situation in the Middle East than we even have right now.
And welcome to the Watchman. The wars and rumors of wars continue in the Middle East. If you thought 2021 would bring peace and harmony to the world's most chaotic region, think again, because Iran clearly did not get the memo. Iranian-backed militias unleashed 3 separate rocket barrages last month targeting American personnel in Iraq. Meanwhile, in Yemen, Iran-backed Houthi rebels continue to unleash drone and missile attacks against Saudi Arabia. And in Syria, Iran is pushing ahead with its efforts to build a military presence at Israel's doorstep. If all that weren't enough, Iran also recently held a massive joint naval drill with Russia. Now, the United States and Israel have not remained silent in the face of this Iranian aggression. In response to those repeated rocket attacks, U.S. fighter jets bombed Iranian-backed militias in Syria on February 25th, and Israel has already carried out several airstrikes against Iranian forces in Syria as well since the beginning of this year. Israel also held 2 major military drills recently along its border with Lebanon, where it is preparing for a coming showdown with Iran's most dangerous proxy, Hezbollah. Bestselling author Joel Rosenberg writes about a potential conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in his brand new thriller, The Beirut Protocol. He joined us from TBN's Jerusalem studio to talk about the book and how its fictional premise is becoming all too real. Take a look. Joel, thanks so much for joining us from Jerusalem. You've got a brand new blockbuster yet again. This one is called The Beirut Protocol. Joel, what I love about your books is they are so true to life. In this novel, you are focusing on the threat to the north, namely Hezbollah to Israel's north. Tell us about how the Beirut Protocol brings that real-life conflict to life for readers.
In 2006, Hezbollah launched a terrorist attack against an Israeli military convoy up along the Israeli-Lebanon border, where I was just spent all day yesterday being briefed by Israeli intelligence officials. And that attack led several Israelis dead, several were captured, but it set into motion a 34-day war in which Hezbollah launched 4,000 rockets and missiles against northern Israel. That was 2006, what was known as the Second Lebanon War. What I envision in the Beirut Protocol is, what if we get in a situation where something like that happens again, but rather than 4,000 missiles in a month, what if it's 4,000 missiles a day landing on Israel? I mean, this would be a devastating, catastrophic war, one unlike we've ever seen in terms of a missile war in the region. But that's maybe not so far off.
Just to refresh people's memories about 2006, look, a good portion of northern Israel, places like Kiryat Shimona, was shut down. People were in bomb shelters for weeks. And that was 15 years ago. And Joel, like you said, Hezbollah's rocket and missile arsenal has greatly increased over the past 15 years. It would be much more dangerous this time around.
I think you not only had, in 2006, 1 million Israelis living underground and in bomb shelters, but you had, or they were fleeing to the south, trying to get outside of the range of missiles. The problem is Nasrallah is saying today that Hezbollah rockets and missiles can reach any city, any village, any town in Israel. And Israeli intelligence officials told me yesterday they believe that. So this is dangerous. Now, it doesn't mean that all of those missiles have precision-guided systems on it, right? But they have the range much further than before. What's more, we were told by these Israeli intelligence officials that there are more than 100,000 rockets and missiles. Publicly, the reports say there may be 150,000 or more. So you could be seeing tens of thousands of missiles landing on Israel. That would not only be devastating in terms of casualties, and damage, but for the economy of Israel, the tourism of Israel, this is a worst case scenario. And the Beirut Protocol is fiction. It's designed to look at what if. But unfortunately, people are saying this may not be so far-fetched.
Hey, the main character, once again, in the Beirut Protocol is a U.S. CIA operative, Marcus Riker. He runs into some trouble along that Israel-Lebanon border. Could you tell us a bit about him and how he also is probably, I would think, Joel, a prototype of many of the people that you've been around over the years on the U.S. side and on the Israeli side as well?
In the Beirut Protocol, the first chapter sets you up. Riker is with a team of U.S. and Israeli security officials, and they're doing an advance trip for the U.S. Secretary of State, who's coming to Israel and going to be touring the region, trying to finalize an Israeli-Saudi peace deal. But the Secretary of State is a woman in this novel, and she's worried about the rising tensions with Iran and Hezbollah. Hezbollah, of course, being the terror force in southern Lebanon that really controls most of Lebanon and is funded, fueled, trained, armed, all by the regime in Tehran. And what happens is Marcus is in this convoy along the Israeli-Lebanon border, again, doing this advance trip when they are suddenly ambushed by a Hezbollah terror cell. And this massive firefight ensues, and Marcus and several members of his team are grabbed and pulled into a terror tunnel underground and pulled deep into Lebanon. That's how the book starts. And so you have the hero already being held captive and beginning to face torture with him and his team. Now what?
Hey, you mentioned an Israel-Saudi Arabia peace treaty as an integral part of the book. Again, folks, this is fiction, but it is very true to life. You have traveled extensively, Joel, in the Sunni Arab world. You've met with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, in the wake of the Abraham Accords, which are continuing to unfold. How likely would an Israel-Saudi Arabia peace treaty be? That would be the big one. If the Saudis and Israel would come to the peace table and forge a deal, wow, that would be a major game changer. Do you see that possibly happening in the future?
I think it's possible. Right now it's fiction, but I think it's possible. And as you know, Eric, just a few months ago, in the fall, December actually, of 2020, we had this breaking story, right, where the Israeli Prime Minister, the head of Israel's secret services, the Mossad, secretly traveled to northwestern Saudi Arabia to meet with whom? The Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Also there was the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, a friend of mine, who is trying to broker this exact agreement before he left office. So it may not be so fictional, right? And I think that was the biggest signal so far, that the Saudis are trying to build a relationship with Israel, and Israel is trying to build a relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think it's more a matter of when an agreement of peace between the two countries would happen, not if. I think for many people, they think, oh, that's just fiction. It'll never happen. I think it's fiction now, but I think it may not be that long off, maybe, before we would actually see that come to pass. I would like to see it.
Yes, Joel, you know, it's fiction, but your fiction books have a uncanny habit of coming true after you write them. So we're keeping an eye on this for sure. Hey, another agreement. We have obviously the Saudi-Israel agreement. God willing, that happens one day, would be a total game changer. The Iran nuclear agreement. We have a new administration here in the U.S. President Biden seems very determined to re-enter that Iran deal or some variation of it. Last question, how could a Biden administration's policies affect everything that we're talking about right now, from the Abraham Accords to the Iran threat, Hezbollah? If the Biden administration comes in with a much more conciliatory tone towards the Iranian regime, what kind of effect will that have?
That's the big question. And I think that the simplest way to put it is, who is more desperate to get a deal, Iran or Joe Biden? I think that's the question, because if Biden wants to get back in that nuclear deal that he helped negotiate during the Obama administration, right? He was the vice president, and he fully supported a deal that you and I both think was not only flawed, but insane. because it really paved the way to a nuclear weapon, a nuclear arsenal. It didn't prevent it. And now everybody in the world is seeing the flaws of that original deal. Now, if Biden wants to go back into a deal that's the same or similarly flawed, even if it had some changes, that's a problem. It's a huge problem. And if Iran senses that Biden is desperate to get such a deal, they have a good sense of smell, and they are going to exploit that for everything it's worth. Now, I think that the Biden administration ought to be intensifying the maximum pressure campaign that the Trump team began and bring Iran's regime to its knees. Iran is struggling. But if you give them cash, if you give them incentives, if you remove the economic sanctions too quickly, if you open bank accounts for Iran too quickly without getting real substantive concessions, what's going to happen? That money is going to flow to Iran, and then it's going to be funneled from Iran to Hezbollah and other terror organizations, and you could have a worse situation in the Middle East than we even have right now. That's my concern, and I think we need to be praying that the Biden administration gets tougher on Iran and doesn't move back to a position of appeasement.
Joel, great stuff as always, my friend. Good luck with the book. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Eric. So honored to be with you. I'm glad you're enjoying the Beirut Protocol.
Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman newscast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, make sure you go ahead and hit the like button, click subscribe, and tap the bell icon to turn on notifications for new Watchman newscast episodes every weekday.